The north is cold and full of whispers.
The document was small. That was the first thing that struck Davos Seaworth when he entered the war chamber and saw it lying on the great stone table. How small it was. One sheet of parchment, folded twice, edges worn to softness from handling. No sigil pressed into the wax, the seal already broken. On a table carved to the shape of Westeros, spread across 6 feet of cold granite. It should have looked like nothing. A scrap. A steward's note about grain. It didn't. Stannis stood at the far end of the table, at the point where the carved stone sea met the carved stone coast of Dragonstone. He was not looking at the document, he was looking at the outline of the neck, at the long stretch of coast that ran north from there to the Bay of Seals. At the point where some craftsman's hand had scratched 3 letters into the granite decades before Stannis was born. Castle Black. His hands were clasped behind his back, his jaw was working. Davos had served this man for 20 years. He had watched him grind his back teeth to nothing over Robert's insults, over Renly's laughter, over Cersei's scheming and Ned Stark's execution, and the slow hemorrhage of lords who should have bent the knee and didn't. He knew what the jaw meant. He crossed the chamber without speaking and picked up the document. He read it once quickly, the way a man reads something his mind refuses to process on the first pass. Then, a second time. Slowly, the words didn't change. "Where did this come from?" Davos said. Not a question. "Varys," Stannis's voice came from across the table. Flat, controlled. Who claims he found it among Lyanna Stark's effects? Carried south from the Tower of Joy by Eddard Stark, who carried them to Winterfell, where they sat in a locked chest for 15 years. A pause. The jaw moved once. Varys claims he did not look at them. And you believe him. I believe the document. Stannis turned. His face in the torchlight was what it always was. No softness, no performance, no room in it for what was happening behind his eyes to show through. But something was there. Something Davos had seen twice before, once on a burning ship on the Blackwater, when Stannis kept issuing orders with fire eating the hull beneath his feet. And once on the night Robert told him Storm's End was going to Renly. The look of a man who has understood something he cannot unlearn. "Sit down, Davos. I'll stand." The muscle in Stannis's jaw moved. He didn't argue it. He crossed to the head of the table, pulled out the chair that was technically a throne, black stone, dragons eating their own tails carved into the armrests, and did not sit in it. He stood behind it instead, both hands on the back, looking down at the map between them. "Robert's claim to the Iron Throne," he said. "What was its basis?" Davos blinked. "My lord?" "Say it plainly. Its basis, right of conquest." Davos set the document down carefully. "And blood. His grandmother was a Targaryen princess. Princess Rhaegar Targaryen." Stannis's grip on the chair back tightened until the knuckles showed white against the stone. Youngest daughter of Aegon V. The Maesters framed his claim as a blood claim because they had to. A pure conquest claim invites the next man with an army. A blood claim gives the dynasty theoretical legitimacy. Something to point to. He stopped. "Do you remember the Great Council? 101 years ago. I know it settled the succession. Jaehaerys called it to choose between his granddaughter, Princess Rhaenys, and his son's son, Prince Viserys." Stannis released the chair. He moved to the window. Outside, the narrow sea was black and enormous, moving under the wind. The lords passed over Rhaenys. She was older. Her claim came first by birth. They passed over her regardless, and the reason they gave was this: the Iron Throne cannot pass through a woman, or through a male heir of a woman. The blood must run through the male line, unbroken, or the claim is compromised. He paused. The sea moved. That precedent was never formally repealed. It was simply ignored when Robert won. The torches breathed. The document lay between them on the carved stone sea. Robert's grandmother, Davos said slowly, was a woman. Robert's claim ran entirely through Rhaegar Targaryen, a female, which means the claim the Maesters used to legitimize his dynasty was the precise type of claim the Great Council had already ruled could not stand. Something moved through Stannis's voice then. Not satisfaction, not triumph. something older and quieter than either. We called it a just war. We said he took what was rightfully his, and every maester who nodded and recorded it that way was either ignorant or a coward. The wind pressed against the tower. The black rocks at the base of Dragonstone ground against the incoming tide, patient and indifferent. Rhaegar Targaryen, Davos said. Crown Prince. Eldest son of Aerys II. Named heir. Stannis pointed at the document without touching it. If that letter is real, and I have had 4 maesters examine the Septon's hand and the wax impressions, and none of them found fault, then Rhaegar married Lyanna Stark before a Septon with proper ceremony, which makes the boy trueborn, which makes him the legitimate son of the Crown Prince. The words came out flat, one after another, the way Stannis said everything that cost him. A male line direct descendant of Aerys II through his eldest son. The claim is not through a woman. It is not conquest dressed as blood. It is blood, unambiguous, running exactly as the law requires it to run. Davos looked at the document, then at Stannis. His claim is cleaner than Robert's ever was. His claim is what Robert's was always pretending to be. Stannis moved back to the table, stood across from Davos with the carved continent between them, Castle Black under his left hand, and King's Landing under his right. Renly would tell me none of this matters, that what matters is swords and gold and who can hold a field. His jaw set. Renly has always been wrong. A throne built on ignored law is a throne built on sand. Every king who comes after must either acknowledge the precedent or suppress it. Robert suppressed it. Joffrey inherits the suppression, and every lord who wants to unseat the Iron Throne will always have the suppression to point to. Always, as long as it stands uncorrected. He looked at Davos directly. The boy's name is Jon. He is at the wall. The room went very still. You mean to go north, Davos said. I mean to follow the law. Stannis's voice did not waver. It never wavered. That was the thing about him that other men called stubbornness, and Davos had long since stopped arguing about. Whatever it costs. Davos looked at the document, at the map, at the man standing behind a throne he was in the act of giving away. My lord. Carefully the men will not understand. I know. The lords will say you've lost your mind. Renly will say whatever he finds amusing. Not quite contempt. Something flatter. I am not doing this for Renly's understanding. Then why? Stannis looked at him across the carved stone continent for a long moment. The sea moved beyond the window. The torches breathed. Far below, the tide pressed in against the black rocks, grinding, slow, the same rocks Dragonstone had been built on, patient as the law itself. Because it's right, Stannis said. Not ambition, not calculation. Not the performance of principle Davos had heard from 100 lords in 100 throne rooms. He had learned, over 20 years. To hear the difference between a man saying those words and meaning them, and a man saying those words because they served him. This was the difference. He picked up the document, looked at it one final time, set it down. When do we sail? He said. Stannis turned back to the window. To the Black Sea. To the north, where the wall stood somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond sight and reason. Where a boy named Jon Snow was wearing black and thinking himself a bastard. With the morning tide, he said. Tell the captains. The water changed color past the bight. Davos had sailed most of the known world in the decades before Stannis found him, and made something official of him, and he had learned to read coastlines and currents the way lords read letters, quickly, without thinking about it. The meaning arriving before the process did. He knew the gray-green chop of the narrow sea, the deep blue of the summer sea past the stepstones, the brown silt-heavy roll of the waters around the mouth of the Mander. The shivering sea was black, not dark blue, not the gray of storm-heavy sky reflected back. Black, the way stone is black. As though the water had decided depth was the only honest answer, and gone as deep as it could go. The surface moved but didn't sparkle. Light fell on it, and was eaten. Davos stood at the stern of the Fury, and watched the color of the world change, and thought about what they were sailing toward, and what they were sailing away from, and whether those two things were as different as Stannis seemed to believe. 14 ships. That was what Stannis had left him. 14 ships out of the fleet that had built the Baratheon dynasty's reputation for naval strength, that had kept the loyalist cause alive during the siege of Storm's End, that had once made the Lords of the Narrow Sea speak carefully when Stannis' name came up. Robert had taken the best ones. Renly would claim what came after. 3 of the 14 flew foreign banners, Salador San and his cell sails, contracted at Dragonstone before departure, men who cared nothing for Targaryen bloodlines or legal arguments, and everything for the gold Stannis had promised them at the harbor's other end. Their ships were fast, and their loyalty was clean in its own way, simple, transactional, reliable precisely because it made no pretense of being anything else. It was not nothing. Davos reminded himself of that regularly. On the 14th morning out of Dragonstone, the temperature dropped enough that the men's breath came in clouds, and the ropes had to be worked twice as hard to keep them from freezing in their coils. The wind came from the north and northwest, and had nothing warm in it, nothing that had touched anything warm in a very long time. Davos watched his sailors move slower than they should, watched them wrap their hands in spare cloth, watched the youngest of them, a boy from the Stormlands who couldn't have been more than 15, stand at the bow and stare at the horizon with the specific expression of someone who had never been cold enough to actually worry about it before. Stannis was at the bow every morning before dawn. Alone, not pacing, not reviewing charts, not doing any of the purposeful things a lord of his temperament usually filled his silences with, just standing, looking north. Davos went to him on the 16th night, when the stars were wrong enough to be uncomfortable and the wind had taken on a sound it hadn't had before, a low note, somewhere below hearing, that Davos felt in his back teeth rather than his ears. "The men are asking questions," he said. "Let them." Stannis didn't look away from the water. His face was red with cold, the only softening the wind had forced on him. "Questions are not mutiny. Not yet." Davos pulled his cloak tighter. The cold here was a different kind than the cold at Dragonstone. It didn't cut, it pressed. Like something enormous leaning against you, patient as a siege. "They want to know if the Red Woman's God is pointing us somewhere no man was meant to go. The Red Woman's God points where I decide to point. Still not looking. Still watching the black water move. I am using her fleet space. I am not sailing on her theology." Davos looked at him for a moment. At the jaw that was working even now. Even here. In the dark, on an empty sea 2 weeks from anything that could be called civilization. And herself. What is she doing? Praying. A pause. Or something that looks like it. On the lower deck, behind a heavy canvas partition that the men had learned not to walk past too quickly, Melisandre kept her fire burning through the nights when the wind should have made it impossible. Davos had seen her standing over it twice since Dragonstone, her red robes somehow wrong in the light they were generating, her face doing something he couldn't read. Not the focused certainty she wore when she talked about Stannis and the Great War and the Long Night. Something else. Something she hadn't resolved yet. He didn't find that comforting. The storm came on the 19th day. It didn't build the way storms built farther south, warning, darkening, the smell of rain finding them first and giving them time. It arrived. The sky went from clear and brutal to obliterated in less time than it took Davos to get from the stern to the mainmast. The waves going from black and ordered to black and furious, the deck lurching beneath his feet so suddenly his shoulder hit the mast before his hands found it. He heard someone behind him go down, heard the rigging shriek wind spray everywhere, rope burn through his palms, the bow dropping away beneath him and then slamming back up the hull. Groaning with it the groan of something large and wooden that had its men shouting in the dark somewhere ahead of him. The cold had stopped. Being cold and become something structural, something the sea was made of, and not the water on it, but the water itself, and the ship was moving. Wrong, wrong, the angle wrong, the sound wrong. Then, Stannis's voice, from somewhere he couldn't see. "Hold the heading. Hold it. Not loud, not shouted, just clear, the way a blade is clear, the way the edge of something is clear, when the light catches it right." The helmsman held the heading. They lost 2 ships. The Lady Lyanna and a transport whose name Davos never learned, both of them there in the darkness and then not there, their signal lanterns swallowed by the wave walls between them. He would find out later they hadn't sunk. Both crews made land eventually, limped into Eastwatch 3 days after the main fleet, but, in the dark during the storm, he didn't know that, and neither did the men around him, and the silence on the deck after the wind broke was the silence of people counting. Stannis did not count. He was already reading the charts for the approach to the Bay of Seals. It was on the 24th day that Davos saw it first. He was at the bow. The morning light was coming in flat and gray off the water, the kind of light that makes everything the same shade of itself, and the coastline to the northwest was a dark line that might have been cloud or might have been stone. And then it wasn't a question anymore, because above the coastline, above the tree line, above anything that should have been there, it rose. The wall. 700 feet of ice. That was what the stories said, and Davos had always filed the stories with the other stories, with the ones about giants and the ones about dead men walking, and the ones about dragons. The category of things that are useful for frightening children, and not much else. But the stories, whatever their other flaws, had been accurate about the scale. It rose above the world. It caught the flat gray morning light, and didn't reflect it, absorbed it, held it inside itself, and let it come back changed, colder. Something the light became when it went through that much ice, and found out what the ice remembered. It went up past the point where Davos's eye wanted to stop. Past the point where it was reasonable, past the point where the mathematics of it, the weight, the centuries, the sheer accumulated human effort, allowed his mind to find a comfortable frame for what he was looking at. He stood at the bow with his hands on the rail and his mouth closed because there was nothing to say about it. Some things are big enough that speech becomes a kind of insult. Behind him, the deck had gone quiet. He heard the helmsman's breathing, the ropes working, the water against the hull. Then, Stannis's boots on the deck planking, stopping beside him. A long silence. The wall held their eyes and gave nothing back. "He's in there," Stannis said. Not a question, not a declaration of intent. The voice of a man who has been sailing for 24 days toward a single fixed point and has now run out of the space that separates him from it. Davos looked at the wall, at the tiny, almost invisible structure at its base where it met the sea, the towers of Eastwatch. Small as toys, the wall rising behind them so large it made the towers look like something a child had placed there accidentally. "He doesn't know we're coming," Davos said. "No," Stannis said. The fleet moved into the Bay of Seals. The ravens always came before dawn. Jon had learned that in his first week at Castle Black, not as a fact anyone told him, but as a rhythm his body picked up from the cold and the dark and the particular silence of the yard at the 4th hour of the morning, when Maester Aemon's birds unsettled in their cages and the night brothers on watch lifted their heads without knowing why. He didn't know what they were responding to. Something in the air. Something that moved before the birds moved. He was in the yard when the message came from Eastwatch. Not training. He had finished training 2 hours ago, in the dark before dark, his knuckles still split from where Sir Alistair's wooden sword had found them for the 3rd time in the same session. He was sharpening a blade, not his, one of the old ones from the armory that had gone soft from neglect, because his hands needed something, and sleep had stopped cooperating 3 nights ago. The whetstone moved, the sparks died in the cold. His breath came in slow clouds. The rider came through the gate hard, horse lathered despite the temperature, and didn't stop at the stables. Jon watched him go, noted the urgency, filed it. The summons came, an hour later. Mormont's solar was the warmest room at Castle Black, which was not saying much. The fire was real at least, actual wood, not the diluted fuel the stewards rationed to the common hall, and it threw enough light that Jon could see the old man's face clearly when he entered. Mormont was standing at the window with his back to the door. He had heard Jon's boots in the corridor and had still not turned around, which meant something was working behind that face that wasn't ready to show itself yet. "My Lord Commander," Jon said, "shut the door." Jon shut it. Mormont turned. The raven on his shoulder turned with him, the old black bird with the yellow eyes that had spent years hearing state secrets and had the decency to keep them. The Lord Commander's face was what it always was. Granite, patient, behind the patience, something moving. A fleet arrived at Eastwatch this morning, Mormont said. 14 ships out of Dragonstone. In the Bay of Seals, in this season, which means they didn't come by accident, and they didn't come for the fishing. He crossed to the table, picked up a piece of parchment, set it down without looking at it. Stannis Baratheon is at the wall, Jon. He will be here by nightfall. The fire popped. A log shifted. Jon said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say. He sent ahead, Mormont said. A letter. Not to me. The old man looked at him directly now. Something careful in it. To you. The parchment was sealed with a stag and a fiery heart intertwined. His name on the outside. Not Lord Snow, not Steward Snow, not the diminutive the senior rangers used when they were in a good mood. Jon Snow. Castle Black. Personal, he broke the seal. Read it. Read it again. The room did not change. The fire made the same sounds. Mormont's raven shifted its weight on the old man's shoulder and said nothing. Because it was a bird, and had more sense than to fill a silence that was doing its own work. Jon set the letter down. His hands were steady. He didn't know why he noticed that. Is it true? He said. I don't know, Mormont said. I know what's in that letter. I know Stannis Baratheon does not bluff and does not lie and has no history of making claims he cannot support. A pause. The fire breathed. I know he is bringing a maester and a septon and something he's calling a certificate of marriage, and that he has requested, in writing, before witnesses, that you be presented to him in the yard at the hour of the wolf tonight. The old man moved to the fire, stood with his back to it, looking at Jon across the stone floor. What I don't know is what you make of it. What Jon made of it was a sound his mind was producing that wasn't words yet. He waited. Stannis arrived as the last light left the sky. He came through the gate on a horse that hadn't enjoyed the road from Eastwatch, flanked by men in Baratheon gold and black. And the Red Woman. Jon had heard about her from Pip, who had heard about her from a man who had been at Storm's End, and come away wearing the specific expression men wore when they described something they couldn't fit into a sensible sentence. She was exactly what he had been told, and also nothing like it. The red of her robes ran too deep for the torchlight to account for entirely. And her face was doing something he couldn't name. Not triumph, not the expression of a woman arriving exactly where she had intended to go. Something unresolved, something still being negotiated behind her eyes. Stannis dismounted without ceremony. Looked at Castle Black the way men who command armies look at fortifications, quickly, filing what he saw. Then looked at Jon. Jon had been looked at in specific ways before. By Ned Stark when Jon was 12 and had done something requiring the face his father wore instead of punishment. By Alliser Thorne every morning of the last 3 months. By Benjen Stark at the feast when Jon said he wanted to take the black, and Benjen's expression had cycled through several things quickly before settling on something Jon was never able to read. This was none of those. Stannis looked at him the way a man looks at a document he has carried 3 weeks through bad weather to deliver to the right person. Jon Snow, Stannis said. My lord. Jon kept his voice level. Your father was Rhaegar Targaryen. Your mother was Lyanna Stark. They married in secret before a septon with the ceremony conducted properly and witnessed. I have the septon's record. I have 2 witnesses to the ceremony who are still living. I have a maester's letter confirming the ink and the wax and the impressions. He stopped. Something shifted in his voice, not warmth, but a different precision. The document names the child Aegon. Aegon Targaryen, trueborn son of the Crown Prince, heir to the Iron Throne. The yard was silent. The name landed on Jon like something thrown from a height. Not his name, a name he had never heard before, not once, not in any story. Not from Ned Stark or Benjen or anyone who had looked at him across 15 years of knowing what he was. Aegon, the name of princes and kings and men who had died in dragonfire and war. Not a bastard's name. Not a name built for a cold yard at the edge of the world. His chest was doing something that didn't have a name. His hands, steady before, still steady now, and he kept noticing that, kept returning to it, the steadiness of his hands while everything above his wrists was somewhere else entirely. "My vows," Jon said. Something crossed Stannis's face. Not impatience, something closer to acknowledgement, the expression of a man who has prepared for a specific question and found it in the right place. The Night's Watch was created by royal decree. Every man who takes the Black swears to defend the realm, which is to say, to serve the purpose the crown itself authorized when it founded the Watch. He paused. His voice stayed flat, informational, the way Stannis delivered everything that cost him. You were a boy with no options and a name that closed every door south of the neck. A king may recall any man to a duty that supersedes a prior one. I am not calling it desertion. I am calling it a transfer of that oath to its proper authority. The last two words arrived separately. You are discharged. From the edge of the yard, Mormont had not moved. He stood with his raven pressed against his neck, both of them still. The old Lord Commander who had spent the better part of 3 years sending ravens south to kings and lords and high septons, begging, in the careful language of a proud man reduced to begging, for someone to take the North seriously, for someone to understand that the wall was not a relic and the darkness beyond it was not a story. A king had come, with 14 ships and 600 men and the specific kind of determination that doesn't require announcing itself. Mormont did not object. At Stannis's left shoulder, the Red Woman was watching Jon. He had felt it before he confirmed it. The quality of her attention had a weight to it, something that pressed. When he looked, she didn't look away. He had expected certainty from her. The expression of a woman whose God had delivered what was promised, exactly on schedule. She looked like a woman reading a letter that disagreed with everything she had memorized. One of the Black brothers near the gate said something to the man beside him. Not loud. Jon caught the shape of it without the words. A few of the men near the armory had stopped moving, standing in the torchlight with the specific stillness of people who have understood something and are not yet sure what face to wear about it. A bastard from the wall. A king from the south. The math of it assembling itself in real time on their faces. Jon looked back at Stannis, at the man who had sailed 14 ships through the shivering sea and ridden a road in the dark to stand in a freezing yard and say a name Jon had never heard applied to himself. "What do you want from me?" Jon said. Stannis looked at him across the torchlit dark. The cold pressed in from every direction. Castle Black held its silence above them, 1,000 years of it. Indifferent as stone always is to what happens at its feet. "Everything," Stannis said. The raven came on the second morning. Jon was in the yard when it arrived, not because he had been summoned, but because the solar where Stannis had set up his operation felt like a room that was measuring him every time he stood in it, and the yard at least was honest about what it was. Cold stone. Cold air. The wall rising above everything, indifferent and enormous, the same wall it had been yesterday, before anyone knew his name. Ghost moved at his heel. The direwolf had been close since Stannis arrived, closer than usual, which was saying something. Jon hadn't worked out yet whether the animal was responding to him or to something about the men who had come with the fleet, the particular smell of agenda that soldiers carried when they were pointed at something and told to march. Ghost had always been better than Jon at reading rooms. He heard the bird before he saw it, the specific sound of wings working hard, the arrival sound rather than the circling sound, something coming in fast from the south with purpose. He looked up without knowing he was going to. Black against the gray sky. Then, gone into the rookery tower. The boy who came running from the tower 2 minutes later was already scanning the yard. Found Jon, came straight to him, which told Jon everything about what the raven had been carrying before the boy opened his mouth. "Maester Aemon says come," the boy said, breathing hard. Now, the message was short. That was the first thing. 3 sentences. Maester Aemon held the parchment out, and Jon took it and read it, and the 3 sentences didn't change, didn't expand into something less definitive, didn't soften themselves on the second reading. Eddard Stark arrested by royal command, charged with treason against the crown. His Grace King Joffrey holds him at the Red Keep. Jon stood with the parchment in his hands. The cold in the room was the same cold it had been before he read it. The stone walls were the same. Through the narrow window the yard was the same yard. Men moving through it, the wall above them all, unchanged and unchanged. His hands were not steady now. "When?" he said. "The Raven is 3 days out of King's Landing." Aemon's voice was the voice he used for things that could not be softened by voice. What it describes happened before that. Jon set the parchment down. His chest had gone very still, the specific stillness that isn't calm, but is what happens when the body can't process everything at once and starts rationing. He thought about Ned Stark's face and then stopped thinking about it, because there was a room full of people, and that wasn't a thing to do in a room full of people. Treason. They had called it treason. The man who had ridden south to be the king's hand because Robert asked him. The man who had spent 15 years keeping a secret that would have been worth a fortune to anyone who wanted to sell it to the right buyer and had never sold it, never whispered it, never used it. The man who had told Jon, the morning Jon left for the wall, that someday he would tell him about his mother. Someday, his jaw tightened. He felt it tighten, and let it. The door opened behind him. Stannis entered without knocking, which meant he had his own intelligence, either a second raven or a man on the door who understood his priorities. He crossed to the table. "Read the parchment in the time it takes to read 3 sentences. Set it down." "They've moved faster than I expected," Stannis said. "Lord Stark arrested my father." The word came out before Jon calibrated it. He heard it land in the room. Let it stand. "Ned Stark kept my secret for 15 years and rode south to serve a king who had no claim to his throne, and they've arrested him for treason." "Yes," Stannis said. "Because of me." Not a question. Not quite. Because he was asking questions someone didn't want asked. Because Cersei knew if Ned Stark started pulling the thread. Because Cersei is intelligent enough to remove a threat before it becomes a problem. Stannis's voice was flat, informational, the way he said everything. She doesn't know about the document. She couldn't. Varys kept it from her specifically. But she knows Ned Stark well enough to know he doesn't ride south without a reason and doesn't serve without looking. He moved to the window. "We've lost the advantage of speed. We move now, or we move too late." Jon looked at the parchment. 3 sentences. Treason, Ned Stark, who was the most honest man Jon had ever known, charged with treason by a boy king on a stolen throne. Ghost pressed against his leg. Warm, real. Jon's hand found the direwolf's head without looking. "How long to reach King's Landing?" he said. "Overland from here, with the men I have, months." Stannis turned from the window. "By sea we could reach White Harbor in a week if the wind holds. From White Harbor south is still a march. But not our march alone." Something moved through his face that wasn't quite calculation and wasn't quite certainty and was something in between the two. "The North has not declared yet. Robb Stark has not declared yet. He is 17 years old and he has 40,000 swords and no idea what to do with them except point them south and hope that's enough." "He's my brother," Jon said. "He is the next Lord of Winterfell if his father is executed." Stannis's voice didn't change. He delivered the word executed the way he delivered every word, without inflation or softening. As a fact that would not become less of a fact by being spoken gently. And a boy leading a northern army without a king to march for is a boy Tywin Lannister can cut through in the Riverlands and be home before winter. He stopped. The silence held its shape. A boy marching for a king is something different. Jon looked at him. Stannis didn't look away. "The North will follow a Stark," he said. "There has never been a question about that. The question is which Stark and under whose banner. Robb Stark marches for revenge and bleeds his father's bannermen into the trident for a cause that dies with him if he falls. One beat. Jon Targaryen marches as a king with the North at his back and changes what this war is for. The fire in the grate was the only sound. Outside, Ghost exhaled. Jon felt it against his leg. He thought about Robb crossing the courtyard at Winterfell in the early morning, the red of his hair, the way he walked with their father's straightness, the confidence that came from never once in 17 years having had reason to wonder whether he belonged somewhere. Jon had watched him from windows, from doorways, from the particular distance of a boy who loved his brother and understood, without anyone having to explain it, that love and belonging were not the same territory. He thought about Ned Stark in a cell at the Red Keep. 3 sentences. Treason. Robb won't follow me, Jon said. He doesn't know. He will need to be told. Stannis moved away from the window. A raven first. Then a meeting. What he does with the information is his to decide, but he will decide it with the truth in his hands, rather than the story Cersei is already writing. He stopped at the table, looked at Jon directly. You said Ned Stark kept your secret for 15 years, that he never used it and never sold it. Jon said nothing. Why? Jon said nothing for a long moment. The fire moved. Ghost's weight was steady against his leg. Because he loved my mother, Jon said, and he thought keeping me safe was how he kept his promise to her. Then his arrest is an act of war against a secret he died to protect. Stannis's voice stayed flat. Everything always stayed flat. It was the most honest voice Jon had ever heard from a man in power. That flatness, the way it never rose to meet the drama of what it was saying. We do not let it stand. Jon looked at the parchment one more time. 3 sentences. The name Eddard Stark sitting at the front of the first one. He thought about the morning at Winterfell, the last morning, Ned's face in the yard, the way the words your mother had lived at the back of his father's eyes, every time he looked at Jon and couldn't say them. His hand found Ghost's head again. The direwolf didn't move. Send the raven to Winterfell, Jon said. Tell Robb we're coming. The ravens had lied about one thing, not the content. The words on the parchment had been accurate. Robb had read the message enough times to know its shape the way he knew the shape of his own hands. 3 sentences that remade the world, and he had read them 6 times between Winterfell and the Neck, and the words had not changed once. But the words had not prepared him for the face. Jon rode in through the eastern gate with Stannis at his left, and the Red Woman at his right, and 20 Baratheon men in formation behind him, and Robb's eyes went immediately to his brother. His brother. The word already wrong, already needing replacement, and found the same face it had always been. Gray eyes. The careful posture. The way Jon's hand went to his horse's neck when he dismounted, the automatic gesture from 1,000 mornings in the Winterfell yard that Robb had stopped consciously noticing somewhere around the age of 12. Same face. Different name. Robb waited until the horses were handed off, until Stannis had done whatever Stannis did when he arrived somewhere, the quick surveying look, the filing, the minute assessment of the fortress's sightlines, and moved far enough away to create the approximation of privacy. Then Jon walked to him, stopped 2 feet away. Neither of them said anything. I didn't know, Jon said. I know. Robb did know. That wasn't the problem. The problem was something he hadn't found a word for yet. Something living in the space between I didn't know and everything it implied. 15 years. Ned's face every time he looked at Jon, the lie that wasn't a lie but was also the only lie their father had ever told them. Father knew. He was protecting me. I know that too. Robb's jaw tightened. He let it. It doesn't make it easier to be standing here. Jon looked at him. The gray eyes doing what they always did, cataloging, assessing, filing the room even when the room was just Robb's face. I'm still Jon. You're also something else now. Robb held his gaze. And our father is in a cell in King's Landing because Cersei figured out that something else exists. He stopped. Moat Cailin breathed around them. Ancient, broken, indifferent, the kind of old that doesn't care what name you give yourself. We need to go in, Robb said. The War Council convened in the largest of Moat Cailin's habitable towers, which was not saying much. The ceiling had been partially restored, enough to keep the rain off, not enough to keep the wind from finding the gaps in the stonework. Torches in iron brackets. A table 4 men had carried from the camp, too small for the number of bodies crowding around it. Lord Greatjon Umber took up the space of 2 normal men and made the room feel smaller by existing in it. Beside him, Galbart Glover and Mage Mormont stood shoulder to shoulder. Lord Howland Reed, small, still, marsh, colored in the way of crannogman. Had arrived from somewhere in the neck without anyone seeing him arrive, which was apparently what crannogman did. Stannis stood at the head of the table, Jon to his right, Robb to Jon's right, which put him at Stannis's right hand, which was either unintentional or the most pointed piece of political geometry Robb had ever witnessed. "The document," Stannis said. He placed the parchment on the table. Beside it, the Septon's record. Beside that, a letter with a maester's seal. A certificate of marriage between Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. Witnessed, properly conducted, with the Septon's account written in his own hand and confirmed by two people who were present. He stopped. "Let it sit. Jon Snow is the true-born son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, a direct male line heir to the Iron Throne." The Great Jon looked at the documents with the expression of a man being shown a contract when what he wanted was a sword. "And who wrote these?" "A Septon, who has since died," Stannis said, "which is why we have his written record rather than his testimony." Convenient? Wars are not convenient. Stannis's voice didn't change pitch. "The document has been examined by 4 maesters. None found evidence of forgery." He looked at the Great directly. "I am not a man who builds his case on fiction. If I believed this document was false, I would not be standing here. I don't doubt you believe it." The Great voice filled the room without effort. But believing a paper and riding 1,000 miles on a paper are two different things. He looked at Jon, the long, measuring look of a man who fights for a living and assesses everything the same way. "I knew Ned Stark for 30 years. I'd follow that man into the 7 hells and not ask about the weather. But this, a gesture that took in the documents, the table, Stannis, Jon, all of it, is a lot to put on a dead Septon's hand." "Robert Baratheon took the Iron Throne through a female line," Stannis said. The room shifted. His grandmother was Princess Rhaegar Targaryen. Stannis moved nothing except his voice. The Great Council of 101 years ago set the precedent that a claim cannot pass through a woman, or through a male heir of a woman. That precedent was never repealed. Every maester who legitimized Robert's claim ignored the same legal foundation they claimed to be operating from. He paused. One breath. "Jon's claim does not run through a woman. It runs from Aerys II through Rhaegar, his eldest son and crown prince, to Jon directly. By the laws the realm itself established, his claim is stronger than Robert's ever was. Silence, not the silence of agreement. The silence of men turning something over and not liking the shape of it." Galbart Glover spoke carefully. "My lord, law is one thing. Swords are another. Saying a claim is stronger in a document doesn't put a king on a throne. Robert knew that. That's why he swung his warhammer. And the dynasty he built," Stannis said, "was constructed on top of Rhaegar Targaryen's son. A beat. If Robert's claim was built on illegal ground, then every king who came after was built on illegal ground. Joffrey sits a throne that was never lawfully surrendered. Not by law, by force only. His jaw moved once. I am not interested in winning by force alone. Any man with enough swords can win by force alone. What I am offering the North is a king whose claim is the law itself." Howland Reed had not spoken. He stood at the far end of the table with his marsh-colored eyes moving between the documents and Jon's face. The stillness of him was the stillness of something that had been patient for a very long time and had learned there was no other kind. When he spoke, the room listened the way rooms listen to quiet men who have clearly been thinking longer than everyone else. "I was at the Tower of Joy," he said. "Everything went still. I held Ned Stark's arm when he couldn't hold himself up afterward." Reed's voice was the voice of deep water, slow and unhurried, going where it was going regardless of what stood in the way. "I heard what Lyanna said before she died. I know what Ned carried out of that tower." He looked at Jon directly. A long look. Not measuring. Recognizing. "I know what you are, boy. I've known for 15 years. He looked back at the room. "The document is real." The Great Jon looked at Reed. Then, at Jon. The measuring look cycling through something, not settled, not decided, but moving. Jon had not spoken since sitting down. He had watched the room the way he always watched rooms, waiting. When he spoke his voice was quiet. Not performing quiet, just quiet, the way a man is quiet when he's stopped thinking about how he sounds. "I'm not asking you to die for a document," he said, "or a legal argument, or a bloodline you've heard about for the first time today." He looked at the Great Jon directly. "Ned Stark is in a cell in King's Landing because he knew what I was and refused to sell it. He kept that secret for 15 years and rode south to serve a king he didn't believe in because Robert asked him to. They've charged him with treason for it." The torch nearest Jon moved, shadows with it. "I'm asking you to march," Jon said, "because he doesn't deserve to die in that cell. Whatever else is true." The Great Jon looked at him for a long time. The wind found a gap in the stonework. The torches pulled sideways and came back. Then the Great Jon sat down. In a room full of men still standing, it was its own kind of answer. Robb watched it happen, watched the largest man in the room fold himself into a chair, watched the decision move across his face and settle there, and felt something shift in the air. Not agreement. Not yet. Something that precedes agreement. The moment before a tide turns, when the water hasn't moved yet, but something underneath it has. He looked at Jon. Jon was not looking at the Great Jon. He was looking at Howland Reed, who was looking back with the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally, in this cold broken tower at the edge of the north, found the right hands to put it in. The army moved the way all armies moved, slowly, noisily, with a smell that accumulated over days until it became its own weather system. Something the men stopped noticing, and Jon couldn't stop noticing, because he had spent 3 months at the wall where the cold killed smell before it could build to anything. 40,000 men, their horses, their supply wagons, their camp followers, their arguments and their fires, and their boots on the King's Road stretching from Moat Cailin south until Jon couldn't see where it ended. It moved. This thing, at roughly 15 miles a day in good conditions and roughly nothing in rain, which the Riverlands provided with a generosity that felt personal. He learned to read the army's mood from the front, not from reports, not from the riders who came back with tallies of who had fallen out of March, how many lame horses, how many broken axles on the supply wagons. From the sound of it. The specific quality of noise 40,000 men made when they were moving confidently versus when they were grinding. He didn't know when he had started doing this. He noticed it somewhere around the 3rd week, the automatic cataloging, the way his mind filed what it heard, and produced an assessment before he'd consciously asked for one. Stannis noticed him noticing. "You're counting paces," Stannis said. They were riding side by side on the 3rd morning out of the neck, the King's Road running south through flat Riverlands ground, the sky the color of old pewter. Not a question. "I'm listening to the pace," Jon said. "It's different today. Slower, the cavalry on the left flank has opened a gap." Stannis looked at him for a moment. The jaw moved once. "Correct. Umber's men stopped twice in the last hour to wait for a supply cart that lost a wheel in the mud. The gap closes by midday or we halt." He paused. "How did you know?" "The sound changes," Jon said. "When the gaps open, the center gets louder. They fill the silence." Stannis said nothing. He had a way of marking agreement without producing it, a slight shift in his posture, a settled quality that replaced whatever tension had preceded the answer. Jon had learned to read it. 3 weeks of riding beside this man had produced a rough catalog of what his silences meant, and this one meant, "Correct, and I was waiting to see if you'd notice it." "A king who cannot read his own army," Stannis said eventually, "cannot deploy it, cannot preserve it, cannot understand why it is failing until it has already failed." He looked at the road ahead. Robert never read his army. He felt his army, which worked until the feelings told him something wrong. He stopped. The jaw moved. "You will not govern by feeling." "I know. Do you?" Not skeptical. Testing, which was different. "Tell me what you feel right now." Jon looked at the road. At the men moving on it, the banners of the northern houses mixed with the Baratheon gold and black, ghost ranging somewhere to the east through the tree line. He thought about Ned Stark in a cell in King's Landing. About Robb riding 3 ranks back, doing the same reading Jon was doing, calculating the same gaps, producing the same assessments, and doing it as Lord of Winterfell and not as king, because Jon was king now, and what that meant to Robb was still a territory neither of them had fully mapped. "I feel afraid," Jon said. Stannis said nothing. And I feel like saying "I feel afraid" is the kind of thing a king isn't supposed to say. Jon held the road with his eyes. Which is probably the problem. Courage is not the absence of it, Stannis said. It is a man afraid who acts correctly regardless. He paused. Any man who tells you he has ridden to war without it is lying, or has not yet understood what he is riding toward. It was the longest thing Jon had heard Stannis say about himself. The lords came to him one by one, not in ceremony, not in formal audience. Stannis had been clear about the timing of that, the specific political sequencing of which house bent the knee first, and who needed to see who kneeling before they would kneel themselves. What Jon got, in the meantime, was campfire councils, mornings on the march when a lord would ride up alongside him and begin, with the varying degrees of directness that northern lords brought to everything, a conversation that was actually an assessment. Lord Glover came first. Practical, spare, asking questions about the wall and the White Walkers that Jon answered honestly, which Glover seemed to have expected and been prepared to respect. The Mormont girl, Jor's niece, 8 years old, Mage's youngest, rode alongside her mother one morning and looked at Jon with the direct evaluating stare of someone who had been raised in a keep full of warriors and learned early that size and noise were not the same thing as competence. "You held the wall," she said. "Not preamble. Not throat-clearing. I was a steward," Jon said. "You trained under Sir Alliser Thorne." The stare continued, unblinking. "Pip says Sir Alliser hates everyone equally. So if you were a steward and not a ranger, it wasn't because Sir Alliser thought you were weak." Jon looked at her. 8 years old. "It was political," he said. "Everything is," she said, and rode back to her mother as though the conversation had concluded on her terms, which it had. The Great Jon came at night, at a campfire large enough to be a meeting rather than a meal, and he did not ask questions. He told a story about fighting beside Ned Stark at a border dispute Jon had never heard of, in a valley in the hills east of Winterfell, and the story was ostensibly about the dispute, but was actually about how Ned Stark had resolved it without killing anyone who didn't need killing. And the reason the Great Jon was telling it was not because he wanted Jon to know history. He was telling him what Ned Stark was. Jon listened to the whole thing without speaking. When it was done, the Great Jon looked at him across the fire with those enormous eyes and said nothing else. Jon said, "He deserves to come home." The Great Jon nodded once, went back to his food. Robb came to him on the 31st night, no ceremony. He appeared at the entrance to Jon's tent the way he had appeared at doorways at Winterfell since they were children, without knocking because there were no doors in their shared history that required it, and sat down across the small fire without being invited, because he didn't need to be. They sat for a while without speaking. "The men are calling you the White Wolf," Robb said. Jon looked at him. "Because of Ghost." Robb's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile, but was the closest thing to it that life had allowed him lately. "The Northerners needed something to call you that wasn't your grace. They're not ready for your grace yet." He paused. "They might never be ready for your grace." "White Wolf is fine," Jon said. "It is." "Actually," Robb looked at the fire. His face in the firelight was their father's face. The jaw, the set of it, the weight behind the eyes of a man who has taken on something heavier than he expected, and has decided the answer is not to put it down. "I've been thinking about what it means. What you are." He stopped. Started again. Catelyn would call it a disaster. She'd be right. She'd be right and wrong. Robb looked up. A Stark on the throne would have changed everything north of the neck. A Targaryen who is also a Stark, he left it there. The fire moved. I think Father understood that. I think that's why he kept it. Jon said nothing for a moment. Or he was just trying to keep me alive. Or both. Robb's voice was quiet. He usually managed to do two things at once. The fire burned between them, the same fire it always was, uncomplicated, indifferent to what the men around it were called. "I need you to command the left flank at the Blackwater," Jon said. Robb looked at him, the shift in his face, from brother to lord, the gears of it moving, the youth and the responsibility colliding in real time and settling somewhere that was both. "You've been planning it. Stannis has been planning it. I've been learning it." Jon held his gaze. "I need someone on that flank I trust without having to verify." Robb looked at him for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Not yes, Your Grace, not the formal answer. Just Robb Stark saying all right across a campfire the way he would have said it at Winterfell when they were boys who didn't know what they were. In the life that existed before 3 sentences on a parchment remade the world. Some things survived everything else. Jon let himself be grateful for that. Quietly, privately, in the way of a man who has learned to carry his gratitude somewhere it won't be used against him. Outside, Ghost moved through the dark. The army breathed around them. 40,000 men and their fires and their arguments and their slow, grinding, faithful march south, toward King's Landing, toward whatever came next. The city appeared out of the dark like something that had been burning for a long time. Not fire, the torches on the walls, hundreds of them, the lighthouse towers and the harbor chains and the gates that stood between the largest city in Westeros and the fleet moving toward it on black water in the hour before dawn. From the bow of the lead ship, Jon could see the outline of it, the walls first, then the rooftops rising behind them, then the red keep above everything, the castle on the hill, the symbol of every throne every Targaryen had ever claimed and every Baratheon had inherited by argument. It was enormous. He had known that. Every man on every ship behind him had known that. Knowing it, and standing on the bow of a ship moving toward it, with the black water under the hull, and the torches on the walls growing slowly, incrementally larger, those were different kinds of knowing. Ghost was below deck. Jon had put him there 3 hours ago, when the tension in the animal had become the specific tension of something that cannot run toward a threat and cannot run away from it, and will tear the deck apart if given no third option. He could feel the direwolf through the hull somehow. The weight of that presence pressed against the boards. Davos appeared at his shoulder. "Wind's with us," he said. Not good morning, not a preamble of any kind, just the tactical fact delivered as all useful facts should be, directly, without ornament. "How long?" Jon said. "The harbor chain comes down in 20 minutes. Assuming Salador doesn't, he'll do it." Davos looked at him sideways, the old sailor's face in the dark, reading Jon's face the way he read water. "You sound certain." He wants to be on the winning side. Jon watched the walls grow. That's the only thing he's ever been certain about. We're going to be the winning side. Davos said nothing for a moment. Then, Robb is in position. I know. He felt it before the runner had come. The left flank moving into place along the road from the King's Road gate, 40,000 minus the fleet force. Robb Stark, at the head of the northern column in the dark, with the specific expression he wore when he had made a decision and was done reconsidering it. "My lord." Davos paused, corrected himself without embarrassment. "Your Grace." The title still sat awkwardly in the air between them, both of them still learning the shape of it. "Stannis asks if you're ready." Jon looked at the city, at the walls and the towers and the red keep on its hill, at the torches burning above a city that didn't know yet what the morning held. "Tell him we sail," Jon said. The harbor chain came down at the 4th hour. The sound of it reached the fleet before the sight did, a metallic groan that carried across the water, low and long, the specific sound of something very large surrendering its tension. Then the chain itself, dropping below the surface, and the gap in the harbor mouth opening like a door someone had decided at last to stop holding closed. The fleet moved through it. King's Landing's harbor defense was the City Watch, and 2 towers that had been designed against a different kind of threat: pirates, smugglers, the occasional Associ raider who misjudged the reach of the Iron Throne. Not a fleet. Not 14 warships and 40 supply vessels carrying men who had marched the length of the continent to be here. The tower archers did what they could. 2 men on the ship behind Jon's went down in the first volley. One of the supply vessels took a fire arrow below the waterline and began to list before anyone could plug it. Then the ships hit the docks, and the calculation changed. Jon went over the rail third. Behind the two men Stannis had assigned to go first and had to be talked past. Because the instruction had been with the first wave and Stannis's interpretation of that instruction was not the literal first two men over the side. Jon's interpretation was different. The dock was wet, and the planking was old, and his boots hit it with a shock that went up his spine. And then the cold morning air of King's Landing was in his lungs, and everything went narrow. The City Watch was not the Lannister army. He understood that before the first exchange. The men at the docks were scared in the specific way of men who have been asked to hold a position against something larger than the position was built for. And scared men hold for exactly as long as they can feel the men beside them holding. Jon moved through the first line with 4 Baratheon men on his left, and the sound of the fleet hitting the docks behind him like a continuous percussion. The watch broke at the third push, not running, not routing, folding the way things fold when the structure beneath them gives. He had done this before. That was the thought that came and wouldn't leave. He had done this before. Except he hadn't. He had never been in a battle. 3 months at the wall training under Alliser Thorne, and the memory of everything he'd read in every book Maester Luwin had ever pointed him at. He had never drawn a sword against a man trying to kill him. His body did not share his uncertainty. It moved through the dock fight the way water moves, finding the path, the gap in the line, the angle that created the opening before the opening existed. He didn't think about it. He would think about it later and try to understand where it came from and not entirely succeed. Right now he moved, and the men with him moved, and the docks fell, and the harbor gate came down from the inside. Someone cutting the rope from above, and the rest of the fleet poured through. From the walls on the southern approach, Robb's horns sounded. 3 long notes. Then silence. Then the sound of 40,000 men beginning to move. King's Landing fell in pieces. Not at once. Not the way the songs would eventually describe it, one great crash, the gates giving, the city opening. It fell the way large things fall, from the edges inward, one gate and then another, 1/4 of the City Watch holding and then not holding, the news of it traveling faster through the city than the soldiers did. By the time Jon's force reached the Street of Steel, the harbor was secured, and the Lion Gate on the west was in Robb's hands, and the bells were ringing, not alarm bells. The full peal, all of them, the kind of sound that tells a city something has already been decided. He found Stannis at the Gate of the Gods, standing, not moving, looking up at the red keep on its hill, with the first light of dawn hitting the towers, turning the stone the color of something between gold and blood. Around him, the city was audible. The specific noise of a population of 500,000 people processing something they had no category for yet. Not screaming, not silence, something between the two, human and enormous and shapeless. "The keep is still closed," Stannis said. "How many inside? The garrison, the household." "Cersei, Joffrey," he paused. "Jaime Lannister." "Tywin," Stannis turned. "Tywin's main strength is still in the Riverlands. He would have needed 3 days' warning to march in time, and we didn't give him 3 days. The jaw moved. He knows by now. He is coming. We have a window." Jon looked at the Red Keep, at the gates that were still closed, still holding, the castle on the hill that had been built to withstand a siege, to outlast armies, to function as its own fortress entirely independent of the city around it. The last argument, the thing between what they had and what they needed. "Cersei won't surrender," Jon said. "No." Stannis looked back at the gates. "She's buying time, waiting for Tywin." Around them the city breathed and murmured and tried to understand what morning had brought through its gates. An old woman in a doorway watching Jon's column pass, with the particular expression of someone who had lived long enough to see more than one king arrive, and had learned to wait before deciding what the arrival meant. A child on a roof, too young to be afraid, watching the banners go by, stag and direwolf and dragon, mixed together, something the sky above King's Landing had never carried before. A man near the Gate of the Gods, a merchant by the look of him, stood in the middle of the road and did not move when Jon's column reached him. Not blocking, not protesting. Just stopped, looking at Jon's face with an expression that passed through several stages before settling on something Jon recognized because he had felt it himself, in the yard at Castle Black, when Stannis had looked at him across the torchlit dark. The expression of a man encountering something he had been told was impossible, and finding out the impossibility was wrong. Jon held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the Red Keep. The gates were still closed. Cersei was inside. Jaime was inside. Whatever remained of the Iron Throne's claim was inside. Pressed into the last corner it had left, waiting for Tywin's banners on the horizon. Stannis moved to his left, Davos to his right. Behind them, the army that had walked from the wall to this hill, 40,000 men who had gone to sleep in the Riverlands and woken up in a different world. "We need to be through those gates," Jon said, "before Tywin arrives." The sun came fully over the hills east of the city. Morning, real morning. The Red Keep caught it and held it, the towers lit from the east, standing exactly as they had stood for 300 years above everything the world had built around them. Jon looked at it the way Stannis had looked at Castle Black from the Bow of the Fury, the way a man looks at the last distance between himself and the thing he has come this far to reach. The bells had been rung for 2 hours. Cersei knew the bells. She had lived inside their sound for 17 years. The morning bells, the hour bells, the specific sequence that announced a royal birth or a royal death. The alarm peal she had heard twice during Robert's reign when fire broke out in the Street of Silk and the city watch couldn't contain it. She knew what each pattern meant. She did not know this one. It had started before dawn and had not stopped. Not alarm and not ceremony, and not anything the bells had been built to say. Just continuous, all of them, the sound of a city producing noise, because noise was the only thing left to produce when understanding had not yet arrived. Joffrey was at the window. He had been at the window since the horns sounded from the Lion Gate, standing with his hands on the sill in the posture he had learned from Robert, without understanding what Robert had understood about it. That the posture only worked if the thing you were watching from the window was going the way you intended. Robert had stood that way at windows when he was winning. Joffrey stood that way at windows as a performance of winning, which was the same posture from the outside and an entirely different thing from the inside. Mother, not turning. "Where is grandfather's army?" "Coming," she said. "You keep saying coming." He turned now. The face she had loved since the moment it existed, the face that was hers more than it was anyone else's, looking at her with something behind it that was not quite fear, because she had raised him to believe fear was a kind of admission. Coming from where? Coming when? "The harbor fell 2 hours ago." "I know." "Then where is Joffrey?" Her voice was the voice she used when she needed him to stop speaking immediately and without argument. He stopped. He was still young enough that the voice worked, which was the only mercy the morning had offered her. "Come away from the window." He came. She watched him cross the room, her son, 14 years old, the crown sitting on his head with the weight of something he had never quite grown into, and sat him in the chair by the fire. He sat. His hands on the armrests were Robert's hands, the one inheritance she had never wanted him to carry. She went to the window herself. The harbor was theirs. That was already settled. The fleet was in, and the lower city was gone, and the sound of it. The specific human sound of 40,000 men occupying streets that had been other men's streets 12 hours ago was audible even here, even above everything the bells were doing. She scanned the gate approaches. The Red Keep's walls were still intact. The garrison was still on them. 300 men between the inner keep and whatever was moving through the city below. Tywin was 2 days out at minimum. She had done the calculation 4 times. It came out the same, every time. The gate came down at the 6th hour. Not by force. That was what she had not prepared for. That was the thing that moved through her chest like something cold finding a path it shouldn't have found. Not a ram, not fire, not the grinding siege work of men who had weeks and patience. The gate came down because someone inside opened it. She felt it before she heard it. A change in the sound below. The specific shift from held to surrendered, from resistance to admission. Then running boots in the corridor outside. The door opened without knocking, which told her everything before the captain's face told her anything. He was young, one of the household guard, the kind of young that hadn't yet learned how to deliver bad news without showing all of it in the first second. Your Grace. Not quite steady. The inner gate. I can hear the inner gate. She kept her voice flat. How long? Minutes. He stopped. Something moved across his face. My lady. They're asking for surrender. A herald came up from the yard. They're asking, I heard you. She had not moved from the window. She made herself not move from it now. Tell them the Queen Regent of the Seven Kingdoms does not receive heralds at her window like a merchant wife. She paused. Tell them she will come down. The captain looked at her. Go, she said. He went. She turned from the window. Joffrey was watching her from the chair, the crown still on his head, something moving in his face that was the closest thing to afraid she had seen on him since he was small enough to be genuinely afraid, without it meaning anything about power. Take the crown off, she said. His hand went to it reflexively. Mother, take it off. She crossed to him. Took it from his head herself before he could decide whether to resist. Looked at it for a moment, the heavy gold of it, the Baratheon stag and the lions intertwined in the metalwork, the thing Robert had worn while she memorized every other man in every room he ever took her into. She set it on the table. You will walk into that yard as my son, not as a king. She held his face for a moment, both hands, the way she had when he was small, and she needed him to hear something completely. Do you understand me? He looked at her. 14 years old. Her son. Her blood. Yes, he said quietly. Jon Snow was not what she had expected. That was the first thing. She had constructed him on the walk down from the tower. The bastard. The shadow. The convenient bloodline someone had pulled from a chest to unseat everything she had built. She had made him in her mind into something useful to hate, something she could look at across a yard and file accurately. A usurper with a septon's note. He was 16 years old, and he looked at her the way the Starks always looked at things, directly. Without the social performance most men wrapped their faces in when they needed to say something difficult. No triumph, no theater, just the specific attention of someone who has understood what this moment costs and is not going to pretend otherwise. Stannis stood at his left, Davos at his right. Around them, the yard full of men in gold and black, and the direwolf banners of the north and something else, a three-headed dragon on black, a banner she had not seen flying above a living claimant in 15 years. Her eyes went to it before she could stop them. Lady Cersei. Stannis's voice. No title, no acknowledgement of what she had been. The keep is ours. You will tell us where Ned Stark is being held. She looked at Stannis, at the flat, honest, unbearable face of a man who never lied and had spent his entire life resenting everyone who did. Robert's hand was arrested on lawful charges. Robert is dead. Flat, informational, he died of the boar wound 9 days ago. You have been ruling in your son's name during a regency that was never yours to hold, on behalf of a claim that Robert's own rebellion did not lawfully establish. He moved one step forward. The yard was quiet enough that his boots on the stone were audible. The marriage between Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark was conducted lawfully. The Septon's record exists. The witnesses exist. The war Robert fought was justified to the realm on the grounds of abduction. A crime? That, per the evidence, did not occur. He paused. A war prosecuted on fraudulent grounds does not lawfully unseat the dynasty it claims to have unseated. The Targaryen line was never lawfully attainted. It was suppressed by force and misdirection. His jaw moved once. We are correcting the record. She said nothing. Because there was nothing to say to it. Not because the argument was unanswerable. She could answer it. She had been answering it in her head since the ravens first arrived from the north. She could dismantle it piece by piece with the right maesters and the right historical precedents and a room full of lords willing to listen. She could do all of that. She had no room. She had no lords. She had a yard. Jaime, she said. Something moved in Jon's face. Not cruelty. Not satisfaction. The expression of someone who has prepared for this and found it exactly where they expected it and feels no pleasure about that accuracy. Your brother surrendered the garrison at the Lion Gate. He paused. He's alive. The cold thing in her chest did something she wouldn't examine until much later. Alone. When there was space to be a person rather than a position. Relief and fury and something underneath both of them that had no name she wanted to give it. He had no choice, she said. No, Jon looked at her steadily. He didn't. He looked at Joffrey then, at her son standing beside her without his crown, 14 years old and trying to hold the posture of something he no longer was. Something passed through Jon's face that was not unkindness. He won't be harmed, Jon said. I swear it. She held his gaze for a long moment, constructed her face into what it needed to be, the performance, the mask, the version of Cersei Lannister that the world had been looking at for 17 years, the one that never admitted, never apologized, never showed what was happening behind it. She was very tired of wearing it. But she put it on, and walked across the yard to stand in front of the son of the woman who had unmade everything. The ravens arrived in threes. Tywin had learned to read them that way, not individually, but in sequence, because a single raven carried news and 3 ravens in succession carried the shape of a collapse. The first one found him at the Greenfork camp, riding hard from the capital, his Riverlands position already shifting under the weight of what the message contained. The second arrived 4 hours later. The third came before dawn, which was when ravens came when whoever was sending them had stopped sleeping. He read all 3 before he spoke to anyone. Then, he sat with them for a long time in the command tent while outside the camp produced its morning sounds, fires lit, horses fed, the low-grade noise of 20,000 men discovering another day of cold Riverlands mud. He sat with his hands flat on the table and the 3 pieces of parchment arranged in front of him and looked at what they added up to. King's Landing, the harbor, the Red Keep, Cersei, Joffrey without his crown. He picked up the 3rd raven again. Read the final line. Set it down. Then he stood, because sitting with it any longer was not going to change what it said, and called for his commanders. Kevin came first, his brother's face in the tent entrance, already reading Tywin's posture before Tywin said a word, cycling through the stages of understanding quickly and then arriving somewhere very still. How bad, Kevin said. Complete, Tywin moved to the map. Not quickly. There was no speed in him that the morning had not already accounted for. King's Landing has fallen. The keep surrendered. Cersei is in custody. He paused. Joffrey is alive. Jaime is alive. Kevin exhaled. The specific exhale of a man who has braced for the worst and found it slightly to the left of where he braced. And Ned Stark. Released, the word cost something Tywin did not allow his face to register. He has been taken back to Winterfell to recover. Which means he is not dead, which means he will be available to counsel a new king for the next 20 years. He looked at the map, at the western coast, at the great rocky prominence above the sea where Casterly Rock sat above everything, 300 feet of natural stone beneath a castle that had never fallen in 4,000 years. We are going home. Kevin looked at the map, then at Tywin, to negotiate, to prepare. Tywin moved the pieces on the map with 2 fingers, slow, precise, the way he did everything. A king who has just taken the capital needs time to consolidate. He has the city, but not the realm. Half the lords of the south haven't declared, and won't until they see which way the wind is blowing through the next 2 turnings of the moon. He straightened. We have time. Not as much as I would prefer, but time. Kevin said nothing for a moment. When he spoke it was carefully, the way Kevin always spoke when he disagreed with something and had weighed the cost of saying so, and if they don't negotiate. If he comes west. Tywin looked at his brother, at the face that had been beside him for 50 years, through everything, the face that knew him well enough to ask the questions other men were afraid to ask. Then Casterly Rock holds, Tywin said. As it is always held. The march west took 11 days. Tywin used them. Every hour of the march, every campfire, every rider he sent ahead, and every rider who came back, he used the time the way he used all time, as a resource that was being consumed and had to produce something before it was gone. Letters went out to the Westerlands lords. To the Arbor, To Old Town. Carefully worded, each one calibrated to its recipient, not asking for allegiance, but positioning the question of allegiance as one that wise men would not answer hastily. Casterly Rock rose above the western sea on the 9th day. He saw it from the road, before the road became the approach, the great golden mass of it. The cliff face, and the towers above the cliff face, and above that the castle itself. 3 centuries of Lannister construction built into and on top of the natural rock, until the rock and the castle were the same thing. The wealthiest seat in Westeros. The most defensible. The place where House Lannister had begun, and where, if it came to it, House Lannister would make its last accounting. He rode through the gates without looking back at his men. The first raven from Jon Snow arrived 2 days later. He read it standing at the window of the High Solar, the one that faced the sea, that his father had used, and his father's father before that. The language was correct, formal, the language of a king addressing a lord. No warmth, but no venom either. It outlined the legal basis of the claim. It named the evidence. It stated what was being asked. Kneel, swear fealty. Retain Casterly Rock and the Westerlands under the new crown. He set the raven down, looked at the sea, poured himself a cup of arbor gold and did not drink it. The answer he sent back was 3 sentences. Tywin Lannister does not recognize the claim. Tywin Lannister does not negotiate under threat. Tywin Lannister awaits whatever the boy king decides to do about that. He did not sign it your lord or your servant, or any of the formulations that were the vocabulary of submission. He signed it with his name alone. The advance riders appeared on the ridge road in the 6th week. He watched them from the high window. Light horse, fast, moving ahead of the main column that would follow, and the banners behind them confirming what the ravens had already told him. Jon Snow had sent cavalry west immediately after King's Landing fell, stripping his fastest riders from the main force and pointing them at Casterly Rock while Stannis brought the army behind. The northern banners came first, then Baratheon gold, then the dragon standard last. They established the siege lines with the methodical discipline of men who had not ridden this far only to be careless at the end. No wasted movement, no posturing. The camp went up in the right sequence, supply lines first, then the perimeter, then the observation posts on the high ground covering the gate approaches. Jon Snow came to the gate on the 3rd day of the siege, alone, no honor guard, no herald. He rode to within speaking distance of the gate and stopped and looked up at the walls with the particular quality of attention Tywin had learned, in 50 years of reading men, to distinguish from its imitations. Not the look of a man performing confidence, the look of a man who has run the numbers and found them clear. Tywin went to the gate himself. They looked at each other through the iron. The boy on the horse, and the old man above the gate, the last lion and the inconvenient dragon, the sum of 15 years of a dead man's secret. "Lord Tywin," Jon said. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The morning was still enough that his voice carried without effort. "You've read the evidence. You know the claim is sound." He paused. "You know Casterly Rock cannot hold indefinitely. You know Robb Stark has the Riverlands sealed. You know the Reach is watching which way this ends before they commit." Another pause. "I'm not asking for your love. I'm asking for your word." Tywin looked at him for a long time. At the face that was Lyanna Stark's bone structure and Rhaegar Targaryen's eyes and something else. Something that wasn't either of them. That was the wall and the black cloak, and 3 months under Alliser Thorne, and the specific quality produced by a person who has found out what they are, under circumstances that would have broken someone who was less. He had assessed men for 50 years, had built and broken houses by his reading of men. He read this one. "Your claim," Tywin said, "assumes the law has always meant something. It has to mean something now," Jon said. "That's what we're doing." "What you're doing," Tywin said, "is replacing one set of convenient arrangements with another. Robert's arrangements served the realm for 15 years. Yours may serve it longer or shorter. History will decide." He looked down at the boy on the horse. "I built this dynasty. I built it before Robert won his war, and I rebuilt it twice after. Every stone of what you've walked into was placed by Lannister hands or Lannister gold. I do not apologize for that, and I will not pretend, for the convenience of your legal argument, that it wasn't necessary." Jon said nothing. "You want my word," Tywin said. "My word was given to a king 17 years ago. That king is dead. The dynasty I served is ended." He stopped, looked at Jon directly. "You are asking me to start again. At 57 years old, under a banner that is not mine, in a world that my grandsons will not inherit." The jaw tightened once. "Ask me what that costs." Jon held his gaze. The morning was very still. The sea moved below the cliff, the same sea it had always been. "I know what it costs," Jon said quietly. "I'm asking anyway." The silence between them held its shape for a long time. Tywin looked at the dragon banner on the ridge, at the sea, at the boy below the gate who had not looked away once since the conversation began, and showed no intention of starting. He thought about Joanna, about the specific thought he had carried since the morning he understood what Robert's war had actually cost. Not the gold, not the political capital, not the careful architecture of alliances he'd spent a decade building. What it had cost, in the category of things gold could not rebuild. He thought about Haymay in custody at the Red Keep. He thought about the word dynasty, about what it meant when the last lion who understood what it required was 57 years old and the next generation had not learned, had never had to learn, had been handed everything instead of earning it the way Tywin had earned it. He looked at Jon Snow one final time, at a boy who had earned something under circumstances that no one would have chosen. His hand went to the gate. "Open it," Tywin said. Not to Jon. To the men behind him, the guards who had been standing in the silence listening to the only negotiation Casterly Rock had ever hosted at its own gate. He said it the way he said everything. Flat, without ceremony, the decision already complete before the words arrived. The gate opened. Tywin descended. The Iron Throne was uglier than the stories. That was the first thing. The songs described it one way, a seat of terrible beauty, swords folded and hammered and shaped by dragonfire into something that communicated power simply by existing. The throne room in the songs was a place where men went to receive judgment and walked out diminished or elevated, one or the other, by the simple act of standing in front of what 300 years of conquest had produced. The room was cold, the throne was black iron and exposed edges, and the specific discomfort of something built to remind whoever sat in it that the man before them commanded everything. The dragonfire that had shaped it was gone. The dragons that had brought it here were gone. What remained was a chair that had drawn blood from every king who ever forgot what it was made of. Jon stood in front of it alone. Not long. He had maybe 10 minutes before the handlers arrived, the stewards and the castle staff who had transferred their careful efficiency from one regime to the next, with the practiced adaptability of people who had survived enough regime changes to understand that the keep needed feeding regardless of whose banner flew above it. 10 minutes before the First Lords were admitted, and the room filled with the specific noise of men performing loyalty to something that had not yet fully decided what it was. He walked to it, put his hand on the armrest, felt the edges under his palm. Ghost pressed against his leg. The direwolf had been in the throne room for an hour, ranging the perimeter of it in slow circuits, and had settled eventually at the base of the steps leading to the throne as though the animal had conducted its own assessment and arrived at a conclusion. Jon looked down at him. The red eyes looked back. He sat. The throne was exactly as uncomfortable as he had been told it would be. He adjusted once, stopped adjusting, put his hands on the armrests, and felt the iron under his fingers, and looked at the length of the room stretching away from him, the pillars, the great doors at the far end that were currently closed. Stannis appeared from the side entrance. He walked to the base of the steps, looked at Jon on the throne with the same expression he brought to everything, assessing, filing, processing without showing the processing. Then he moved to stand at Jon's right, not performing the gesture, just placing himself where he had decided he should be. "Tywin's men are integrating with the garrison," he said. "I know. He's not happy about it. I know that too." Jon looked at the doors. Is he going to be a problem? He's going to be exactly as much of a problem as you allow him to be. Stannis's jaw moved, which means the answer depends entirely on you. Jon thought about Tywin at the gate, about the look on that face, the assessment, the long silence, the specific quality of a man deciding something enormous with the outward appearance of a man deciding nothing at all. The gate opening, Tywin descending. He had not knelt easily. He had bent one knee with the careful deliberateness of a man making a decision he had made with full awareness and intended to hold, which was as much as Jon had asked for and was enough. "He stays at his post," Jon said. "The West is his. That doesn't change." Stannis said nothing. The silence that meant, "I disagree but understand your reasoning and will not contest it here." "You think it's a mistake," Jon said. "I think it's either the most dangerous decision you've made or the wisest. I won't know which for a year." He paused. "Neither will you." Robb found him an hour later. The court had convened, a session Jon kept deliberately brief. Acknowledgments, the formal recording of surrenders, the necessary administrative language of transition that the maesters needed for their records. Robb had stood to Jon's left through all of it in the direwolf armor of the young Lord of Winterfell, doing the thing Robb did when he needed to hold a position and not show what it was costing him. Holding it completely. Showing nothing. Afterward he came to the small chamber off the throne room and found Jon already there. Jon having escaped the court with the same speed and for the same reasons. They sat across from each other. "Father's in White Harbor," Robb said. "The maester's letter came this morning. He's recovering." He stopped. "He wants to come south." Jon felt something in his chest do something complicated. Tell him to wait. He won't wait. Tell him anyway. Jon looked at the table between them. Tell him the king requests that Lord Stark rest until he's well enough to make the journey properly. He paused. Tell him we need him whole. Robb looked at him for a moment. The Stark face doing what Stark faces did, holding the weight without performing the holding. He's going to want to see you. I know. He's going to have things to say. I know that too. Jon looked up. So do I. They sat for a while after that, not speaking. The way they had always been able to sit without it meaning anything was wrong. The room around them was red keep stone, centuries of it, carrying everything that had happened in its walls the way stone carries everything, without judgment or preference. Just holding. You should go home, Jon said. Winterfell needs its lord. Robb looked at him. I need Winterfell held by a Stark, Jon said. That's what I need. He held his brother's gaze. The North is what this was always for. Not the throne. The North. He stopped. Something moved through his voice that he let move. Someone has to be ready. Robb understood. He had always been quick, whatever else the world had made of him. He understood in the way of a man who had been thinking the same thing and had been waiting for permission to say so. All right, he said. Ned arrived on a gray morning 3 weeks later. Jon was in the yard when the gates opened. He had not planned to be in the yard. He had planned to receive his father formally in the throne room. With the court assembled, and the correct ceremonial weight of the occasion properly acknowledged. He had been planning it for a week, the way Stannis had taught him to plan, who stood where, what was said first, the sequencing of it. Then the gates opened, and he saw Ned Stark's face, and every plan he had been making for a week became irrelevant in the time it takes for a face to cross a yard. Ned had lost weight. He moved with the careful posture of a man whose body had recently argued with him and was still making its objections known. His face was the same face, the jaw, the weight in the eyes, the stark bones that Jon had been seeing in his own reflection since he was old enough to understand what he was looking at. He crossed the yard. Jon met him halfway. They stood in front of each other. Ned looked at him for a long time. Not at the king, not at the crown. At Jon. At the face he had been looking at for 16 years, with something living behind his eyes that he had never been allowed to say. I should have told you, Ned said. His voice was rough, not just from the journey. You should have, Jon said. Not angry. Just true. The space for anger had existed, and he had spent time in it, and had come out the other side, the way you came out of things you couldn't change, not unchanged, but through. I understand why you didn't. Do you? You were afraid. Jon held his gaze, You were afraid of what I'd do with it, what someone else would do with it, if I knew." He paused. "You were right to be afraid." Ned's jaw tightened. Something moved through his face, not agreement and not disagreement, but the specific expression of a man hearing a thing he had believed in private for 15 years, said plainly for the first time. "She made me promise," Ned said. At the end, "She held my hand and she made me promise." His voice went somewhere quiet. She loved him, whatever the realm believed. She loved him, and she didn't want the son of that love to spend his life as a target. He stopped. "I kept the promise. I don't know if I kept it correctly." Jon said nothing for a moment. He thought about Lyanna Stark's face, which he had never seen except in the statue in the Winterfell crypts, the stone face that was also his face, the bones that had passed through her to him. Everything she had given him without being alive to know she had given it. He thought about the promise she had extracted. The weight of it. 15 years of Ned Stark carrying that weight without complaint, without acknowledgement, without anyone to share it with. "You kept it," Jon said. "You got it wrong in some ways, and you kept it." He paused. "That's all any of us do." Ned looked at him across the space between them. His eyes were doing something that Ned Stark's eyes were not built for, and were doing anyway. The same thing they had always done when he looked at Jon, except now there was no secret sitting on top of it. Just the man. Just the boy. Just the 15 years of love that had never required the secret to be true. Jon stepped forward, and Ned's arms came around him, the grip of a man who had been afraid for a long time of what it would mean to let go of what he was holding, and had now let go of it, and Jon held on, and the yard was quiet around them, and Ghost sat at the edge of it with his red eyes and his patience. The morning the court assembled for the first formal session of the new reign. Jon sat the Iron Throne. The room was full. The lords who had declared, the lords who had waited to see which way it fell, and were now falling in the right direction with the practiced smoothness of men who had been falling in right directions all their political lives. Stannis at his right. Davos behind Stannis. Howland Reed at the back of the room, small and still, and marsh-colored. Carrying the secret he had carried for 15 years now, finally laid down. Jon looked at the room. At the faces. At the weight of what they represented. The North and the South and the Riverlands and the West, and everything between. The 7 kingdoms that had spent 15 years under a king whose claim was built on ignored law, now standing in front of a king whose claim was the law itself. He thought about the wall, about Castle Black and the cold and the darkness beyond it, and what the darkness contained that no one in this room fully believed in yet. About Jorah Mormont and the Black Brothers and the ravens that kept flying south with messages that kept being filed alongside the things the South preferred not to think about. That was the real work, not the throne, not the politics. Not Tywin in his castle, or Cersei under house arrest, or the careful sequencing of lords and alliances that Stannis was already mapping on 3 different pieces of parchment. The cold was real. The darkness was real. The things in the darkness were real. He had been to the edge of it, and back. He knew. He looked at the room one final time. At the faces of the people who were now his to protect, not by conquest, not by performance, but by the simple and enormous fact of being the one who understood what was coming and had the authority now to do something about it. He sat the Iron Throne and looked north. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.